Well, with us today is Keith Findlay, and he's going to be helping by arranging the bicycles and holding them and so on. And what he's holding at the moment is the frame of a 1930s Grubb recumbent. When Alex was first looking at the design of bicycles, he considered various riding positions, and experiments were carried out with a recumbent to see whether the recumbent position was going to be better than the classic position. As we all know, he eventually rejected the recumbent position, but this is an important machine or frame of a machine from that period. Also with me today is my wife Rosemary, and she's got here the bike that really got Alex thinking about bicycle design in the first place. This is a Curly Hitchins which he bought during the Suez crisis when fuel was rationed in the UK. A very nice classic lightweight, one or two slightly individualistic features about it. Of course, specifically, we've got the curly stays at the back, much beloved of many enthusiasts on the basis that they are believed to give a little bit of resilience to the ride. Very much disputed. Other people unkindly say that it's an expensive way of adding a pound to the weight of the bicycle. But whichever way you look at it, the Hitchins is a very, very nice lightweight machine, and this is the standard against which Alex started to evolve his design. Now what Keith is showing us here is the first Moulton bicycle frame. This was the monocoque, made out of 22 gauge duralumin sheet in 1959. Extremely rigid, open frame, weighing about 5.5 pounds, and you can see the riveted construction. Let's go in a little bit closer on that now, and you can see a little bit of the sort of detail there of how the thing was put together. This machine, when it was built up, had front suspension but not at the back. Went quite well, was allegedly quite noisy. Give it a tap, Keith, and we'll hear the sort of yeah, you can imagine what that might have sounded like coming down the street. But it was the start. Very early monocoque design, arguably the first, at least of this particular type, and an interesting stage in the evolution of the Moulton. This next machine is much more like the Moulton of the 60s that we all knew, and in fact is very close to the machine shown in the original Moulton patent drawings. This prototype dates from 1960, and you can see most of the characteristics of all later Moultons in there. The open frame, the multi-adjustable unisex aspects of the frame, and the suspension front and rear, with small wheels and plenty of space over for luggage carrying. But a number of the details are, of course, very different. So again, if we have a look in a bit more detail, zoom in there, let's have a look at the rear triangle, so to speak. And here you can see that we've got a rubber block suspension, and we've got a rear trailing arm which has very small diameter tubes. Let's zoom in a little bit closer there, and you can see that you've got the sort of size of tube there which was later to be used by Alex in the space frame Moultons. It was something which was a bit of an evolutionary dead end at this time, because as we all know, the solution that was adopted on production Moultons was rather different. But you can see that the idea of using thin diameter tubes, which again is echoed at the front end, was present. And look again at this front end suspension. Here we've got a leading link with rubber in compression in a clapper box arrangement. Very different from what happened in the production machine. And again, nonetheless, very much part of the Moulton pattern of front suspension, which was to be conserved on all later designs. What we've got here are a couple more evolutionary designs from the late 50s, early 1960s. Keith's holding here an experimental Moulton which was very much used to get the steering geometry right. So if we zoom in, for example, onto the steering head here, you can see that there's a quadrant device which allows the steering head tube angle to be altered for experimental purposes. And if we look down at the bottom, you can see there's a slider where the front axle is attached, which enables the wheel to go back and forth to get varying degrees of trail. So a machine very much for experimenting on, not a finished piece of work at all, but a mobile workshop, if you like. Now if we swing round to this machine here, this is really rather an elegant beastie. This has a fairing designed by Pininfarina. Now Farina, of course, was very much involved with the styling work for BMC motor cars at the time, with which Alex was also involved on the suspension design side. So here from the studios of Pininfarina in Italy is this aerodynamic and also weather protecting device on the front of the machine. Very elegant machine, generally like the one that was featured in the patent drawing, the machine we saw a couple back. You can see the same sort of front and rear suspension, and in this case, of course, an early example of the large Moulton rack which we were to become very familiar with. You can see the way it's fitted into the extension of the small carrying handle cum top tube, and in this case is detachable. Here's a little view inside the museum itself, where you can see the Hetchins in the background, followed by the monocoque frame, then the variable head machine, a rather nice machine with fairing and basket on the back of it, the Pininfarina faired prototype, the one very similar to that which was featured in the patent, which we saw outside, and another similar variant. You can see really that there's a progression there from the Hetchins inspiration through to something very similar in concept, though not in detail, to what actually went into production. What we're now going to do is to move on to the production phase and the later prototypes that led up to that. Well, by 1961, the prototypes were getting very much like the sort of thing that was put into production. And here is a late prototype from 61. You can see a lot of the characteristics of the production models, right down to the billiard cue device, which was an optical trick to offset the possible worrying effects to potential purchasers of the long cantilever seat tube and head tube. But there are still some subtle differences. If we zoom in, for example, to the front suspension there, you can see that the directional control from the steerer is provided by a hinge arrangement, rather like the sort of thing you see on the undercarriage of an aircraft. That was, of course, later to be replaced by nylon steering splines, or rather metal splines in a nylon bush. Now, if we look at the rear suspension, again, a simple kind of clapper box arrangement, not quite as sophisticated as that which was used in the final production. But there you can see a basket, again, something which appeared in slightly different form on the production models. And all in all, as we step back and look at the whole thing in totality, not a million miles removed from the production deluxes which we saw in the 1960s. And on that theme, Keith over here has just such a machine. He's going to wheel it over for us to have a look at, and this in many ways is the archetypal Moulton of the 1960s. A billiard cue deluxe with the amber wall tyres based on the Dunlop Sprite, front carrier to carry 20 pounds of luggage, rear carrier to carry 50, unisex frame, and Sturmey Archer 4-speed. Really a very nice example, highly collectible, and the machine that did so much for the cycle industry over here. Well, the Deluxe which we were just looking at went on the market with the other early Series 1 machines in March 1963, but of course the machine was launched late in 62, and in December 1962 a significant event occurred, the breaking of the Cardiff-London record by John Woodburn. This is the machine that John used, and it's very much a standard Moulton frame as used in the Series 1 production, from which the carrier beam has been sawn off, lightweight components have been fitted. You've got the big chain wheel there, which we'll zoom in on now. Quite a nice little beastie there. And that was driving a Sturmey Archer FC close ratio 4-speed, actually a 1958 one, because by this time those had gone out of production. Now you can see some very tatty looking tyres there. That's the process of time, decay of the best part of 40 years on very thin tubulars. These were nominally 18-inch tubulars, but of course tubular sizes date from the time when tubulars were about 1.75 inches in diameter, and they'd shrunk down to rather less than that, so the real diameter was about 16 inches. And those were obviously the format used on the early racing Moultons. So let's go wide angle again and see this rather nice machine. This was ridden in very adverse conditions. It was in December. John Woodburn was then a 25-mile champion, and he ended up riding 162 miles. It was done on a hub gear. It was a small-wheeled bike. It had suspension. The experts said it was a rather silly thing to do, and yet it knocked something like 16 minutes off the record. Really quite an achievement. And that was something which very much helped the promotion of the Moulton in the early days. Now, we're not going to go through every model in the Moulton range. That would be rather boring, I think, but a very significant model or sub-range was the stowaway. And this is a rather nice example, the S stowaway, which was fitted with lighter weight components. Of course, the whole thing about the stowaway was that it took apart for stowage in the back of a car or on a yacht or whatever. And you can see that there's a break point in the middle of the beam. At least you can if we zoom in a little bit. Here we go. There is the brake joint, which was operated by an Allen key and allowed the two ends of the bicycle to come completely apart. Now, this particularly nice example here of the S range, which was built in or assembled in a separate works in Bradford-on-Avon under the direction of Jack Lauterwasser, this one is chromium plated, which was an optional extra, and it does look rather elegant. You can see it's got the narrow section high pressure tyres. These were derived from the tubulars in the sense that the braking radius of the rim is exactly the same as the tubular to enable people to interchange between high pressures or tubs. And that's the origin of what is now the 17-inch Moulton format. In those days it was called 16 by 1 1/4, and these are the very rare amber wall tyres from that period. You don't see many of these around anymore. And you can see that the rubber is tending to break down a little bit. Well, for heaven's sake, they're 35 years old or so. You can't really grumble about that. But there we are, very nice, relatively lightweight stowaway from the period, and it's fitted with the Duomatic 2-speed coaster brake. You can also see, if we zoom in again, that the carrier comes off completely. There's a quick release handle underneath, and the carrier with the bag can be taken off and stowed away in the boot of the car. Now, panning round now and going wide angle again, we've got Keith here with another significant model from the early range. This is the Safari, the touring variant. Lightweight transmission, Sturmey Archer 4-speed again, although there was an option to add on a derailleur as well to give you 8-speed, so 2-speed derailleur with a 4-speed hub. An extra large rear bag with side pockets. This was expandable upwards so that you can see there's a deep flange around the top, so you could expand the height of the bag, and it also had loops on the top. Let's see if we can pick them up here. Yeah, there we go. Loops on the top to tie on a tent and things like that. Extra luggage. At the front, a similar sort of bag, again expandable upwards, and the front carrier, and bottle cages either side. Aluminium mudguards on this particular one. That is the Safari, the definitive Moulton touring bicycle of the mid-1960s. While we're looking at this stowaway here, we'll just zoom in on the rear suspension a little bit, because of course one of the differences between the early prototypes and the production versions was that the rear suspension element, the rubber, is not just in direct compression, it's in shear and compression at the same time, because it's got a radius to it. You can probably just see a slight curve, but that's offset from the radius of swing of the rear arm. You see the pivot bolt in the center of the picture now. So what happened was that the rubber was squeezed and sheared at the same time, and that gave it an increasing rate. In other words, the rate of spring, to put it in crude terms, got stiffer as the load increased, and this was self-compensating. It's one of those reasons why with an early Moulton you never seem to hit the stop on the rear suspension. It's a very nice characteristic, and in many ways the heavier you load them, the better they ride. Just now we were looking at the rear suspension of this typical Series 1 or Series 2 Moulton. That particular one we were looking at was Series 2 because of the straight rear fork blades. Now we're looking at the front. Very similar on all the Series 1s and 2s, and indeed on the Mark III. But you can see this bellows here, and Keith is now going to roll the bellows